Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Caroline Colas, and I am the Senior Director of Health and Wellness at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. Today, on our Positive Psychology Hour, a partnership with Whole Being Institute, we're going to be talking with Sanj, Katyal. Stop chasing happiness. If you're like most people, you've been searching for something all of your life. Some call it happiness, others call it success. But no matter what we achieve, the goalposts seem to keep moving. Success, one goal is followed by searching for another, and we remain unfulfilled. Does this sound familiar? Sanjay is going to be the author of Positive Philosophy, Ancient and Modern Wisdom to Create a Flourishing Life, is joining us today for a lively discussion about flourishing, meaning, and fulfillment. This is not another self-help discussion about how to be happy. Rather, a look at how the science of positive psychology informs a theory of positive philosophy, a practical and personal operating system for an optimal life. And I'm so excited to have him talk to us about that, the difference between positive psychology and positive philosophy. Sanji holds a Bachelor of Science degree from University Honors in Chemical and Biomedical Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and a medical degree from NYU. He is the founder of Positive Psychology Program for the Physicians and president of Optimal Life Imaging Group. He also holds certifications in positive psychology and positive psychology coaching from Whole Being Institute and has published and lectured extensively on well-being and the science of happiness to audiences ranging from college students to physicians. Currently an adjunct professor at La Roche University in Pittsburgh, Dr. Katyal teaches the class on how to flourish, lessons from positive psychology. He also is the co-founder of the course Thrive RX, a practical guide to flourishing for physicians by practicing physicians. He lives with his family in Pittsburgh, and his research interests include developing a new model of optimal wellness, incorporating principles from psychology, organizational leadership, health neuroscience, and medicine. And he's currently investigating the effectiveness of positive psychology interventions on physicians' well-beings. And that is something that is really crucial at the moment. Welcome to the call. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
First, before we start, could you tell me just how you even found out about the Whole Being Institute and what brought you to explore that certificate program?
Yeah, as most things in life, it's kind of a circuitous route and not really planned. I was a physician executive at a startup company for about 10 years, and I would travel to a lot of hospitals and meet with a lot of physician leaders. And this is probably about 2010 or so. And I began to notice a growing discontent among a lot of the physicians that I met. It didn't really matter what state or what specialty they were, but they were just dissatisfied and unhappy. And, I remember driving home from one of these hospital visits, wondering why I wasn't happier myself. It's not that I was unhappy, but I had achieved pretty much everything that I had set out to do, right? I was married to my best friend. We had 4 healthy kids. I had a great job. Both sets of parents were alive. So I really had no real adversity. And I began to really, worry that if I couldn't figure out how to experience more joy and more meaning when things were this good, how was I ever going to deal with, stuff down the road when adversity would hit, which, I knew it would eventually. So I began kind of researching and studying, and I was really trying to figure out an answer to a single question. I was tired of just functioning. I really wanted to figure out how to go beyond that. And I didn't really have a word for it, but really the word probably now is flourishing. So I really immersed myself in a lot of philosophy, psychology, and I came across Tal Ben-Shahar's book, Happier. And, this was a great book because it was kind of an analytical approach to happiness. And as an engineer, I kind of really resonated with that. So I reached out to him via email and just said, "Hey, this is a great book. I'd love to learn more." And he's the one that connected me with Megan and invited me to do to apply for SIP and do that. And that's really the kind of entry to positive psychology for me, and it's been great. So.
Wow, what a beginning, fortuitous beginning. And you said that your final project actually led you to write the book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was. I think like most people, we all feel like we have a book within us waiting to come out at some point in our life. Um, but the final project was really it was a it was something that I wish I had read 20 years ago, and I wanted to write the book that I wish I had read back when I was younger, and so I discussed it with Tal. Um, Back, at Kripalu, and he encouraged me to do that. He thought it was a great idea, and even volunteered to read some early drafts, and he ended up giving me a nice uh, blurb on the cover and everything. So it was great, but I owe a lot of that, and really a lot of where I am now to that initial email to Tall, and then also to the entire whole being staff, and of course I recommend it all the time to people. So.
Yeah, no, I will put in a link in the chat because the new cohort, excuse me, is they're taking applications for that. So I will recommend that to everybody. Can you discuss in your book, you talk about the difference between positive psychology and positive philosophy and how they relate to flourishing, meaning, and fulfillment. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I like to try to simplify things in my own mind, because sometimes these concepts are, like these concepts of happiness and well-being and all, they mean different things to different people. What I like about philosophy was that the goal of the ancient philosophers was to learn how to live the good life, right? Live better, live life so that when you're on your deathbed, you look back with no regrets, right? That was their goal, is to, and they had different approaches to it, but the goal was the same: to live the good life, live a life with virtue and all of the other stuff. But they didn't really tell you how to do that, right? They just had a bunch of opinions, and they had a bunch of theories, from the Stoics to Aristotle and so forth. What I like about positive psychology, as I was learning about it, was really trying to give an evidence-based roadmap of things that really matter on a road to flourishing. But what I didn't like about positive psychology was that it was kind of confused with a lot of platitudes and just slogans, and it was hard to figure out what's evidence-based and what's not. And I think that probably still is a little bit of an issue. So I try to combine the best of positive psychology, which is that evidence-based roadmap of studying, what works on the road to flourishing, with the original goals of philosophy, which is how do I live better? How do I live a good life? And I combined kind of the best of both fields into a like a personal operating system for myself, really, because I wanted to figure it out for me personally. And then over the years, I've been able to work with other physicians, other students, and so forth, to kind of teach, maybe a little bit of a different approach, which is the optimal living, combining these two fields into one.
Can you give us an example of sort of like the platitudes versus the operating system that you found, something that you were sort of like, oh, this is confusing, and then how that the process of writing the book, you were like, oh, this is the operating system. This makes more sense. This is more practical.
Well, yeah, like I didn't understand why, as physicians, and actually for most people, we're all kind of masters of delayed gratification, right? We put our heads down, we do our work, we wait till we get to the next level to finally be able to sit, enjoy life and relax. But that level really never comes. And for physicians, that was really a problem because we've deferred a lot of gratification over many years. And I didn't understand why that happened. Like, why, when we hit something that we finally want, why doesn't that pleasure or satisfaction last? And so some of the platitudes would be, well, be happy, or, um, think about what you have. And all of that stuff is fine. But I wanted to go upstream a little bit rather than try to control the response to a thought or to a negative emotion. I wanted to understand why that negative emotion, or the pleasure that was fleeting, why is that fleeting, right? And that was the really the genesis for understanding and delving into things like hedonic adaptation, which I think is a big problem for everybody in life. And it's not taught, it's not known, and it's the reason why I think a lot of people feel unfulfilled. And then you can kind of go deeper and into why that occurs in the first place. And so there's many levels of a lot of this stuff.
Can you take us through that? Because that was actually my question for you regarding hedonic adaptation. For those that may not be familiar with it, it sounds like that's been really a crucial place in your own trajectory of your own fulfillment. Can you talk
Yeah,
about that for us?
sure. Yeah. So hedonic adaptation is basically a principle that I think positive psychology does a really good job of unpacking and explaining. And I know Sonia Lebermersky does a good job of talking about it in one of her books. But basically, we get used to everything in our life that's constant. So that new car, that new job, even our family will eventually kind of fade into the background of our lives. And we'll just take it for granted. And I think we can all look back on our life, or even today, and think about all the things that we take for granted, um, and the Stoics talked about this a long 2000 years ago, which is why they thought you should be indifferent to external circumstances as it relates to your happiness, because you're eventually going to get used to them. And yeah, so this principle has been talked about in, the famous study was Brickman, the lottery winners and paraplegics, which has been very misleadingly quoted in the literature. What he basically said was 18 to 24 months after a big win, or after the tragedy, most people were basically back to their baseline. Now, what that's been interpreted at is lottery winners are equally happy as paraplegics, which is not what the study showed at all. But it just shows that we adapt to positive and also negative circumstances in our life. Negative takes a little bit more time, but we adapt to it. And this is a big problem if we're talking about improving our well-being, right? So if we're trying to get happier, but every level we just adapt to it, and we feel, and we come back to our quote baseline levels of perceived happiness, it's a huge obstacle. And so I wanted to understand why that occurred, and to do that, you really have to go into the evolutionary traps of our mind. And, I think a simplistic way to understand this is, and I think this is a key to some of the chasing that we're all doing in life. Basically, at our primitive state, our brainstem and our limbic system was adapted to look for threats and opportunities in the wild, right? On the banks of the Sahara, we were basically searching for threats and opportunities. If you look at how a dog behaves, it's going to bark at strangers and it's going to pick up food on the floor. That's basically, in a nutshell, how we are at our primitive level. And then as society evolved, we grew our prefrontal cortex to have this concept of our identity, or what people call ego, not bravado, but ego or manufactured self, or whatever the Buddhists call the self. But the goal was the same. It was to handle hostile interactions. Now it's just within society. And so our minds are always searching for opportunities and threats. And if you think about every thought you have, it's basically one of those two things. You're either chasing pleasure or avoiding pain. Um, and the the principle of hedonic adaptation is basically the minds can never be satiated, because to be satisfied at the mind level or the ego level would threaten its own survival, its very survival, which is its whole purpose is survival, right? And so that's why principles of hedonic adaptation, that's why they exist, is because you have a mind's demand for survival. And it's the other thing is affective forecasting. It's another great field, the study of what we think will make us happy. Impact bias is another thing, right? We overestimate how happy or unhappy we're going to be at some future event, right? Tenured college professors overestimated their unhappiness or happiness after being granted or denied tenure. And there's a bunch of populations that it's been studied, right? But this is a motivational tool based in our evolutionary survival instinct, because it makes us work extra hard to get something that we think is going to be really great, or avoid something that we think is going to be really bad. And it's all at the level of the mind and its evolutionary traps. So that in a nutshell is hedonic adaptation.
So is that why you say we should stop chasing happiness?
Yeah. Because, at our baseline, at varying levels, we all feel restless and unsatisfied. And that's due to our minds constant searching for opportunities and threats. It's also due to an inherent conflict between our mind's demand for survival and our kind of unfulfilled potential at our, what I call our unique core being level. We all have, deep inside of us, something that is unfulfilled. People call it potential. People call it limitless possibility. Some people call it soul. Whatever word you want to say, there's something inside each of us that is trying to get out, really, and it's being held hostage by our mind and the mind's demand for survival, and constantly, putting out. That's why we live our lives putting out fires, right? Each day just differs in the size of the inferno we're fighting. That's the mind. That's at our level. So we feel at a baseline not good, and so happiness is this chase that we want to feel differently, right? We want to feel better. We want to feel pleasure. We want to feel something other than the way we normally feel. But pleasure is fleeting, right? Hedonic adaptation, we get used to it. And if it's related to, a favorable circumstance or something that goes our way, we know that life is unpredictable and there will be another circumstance that doesn't go our way, right? So it doesn't last. This feeling of feeling better doesn't last. And it's just a never-ending chase. And it just keeps us right back where we are, which is, varying degrees of restlessness and dissatisfaction.
So let's go back to your original reason for studying positive psychology, and as a physician, and sort of saying, wait a minute, something's going to happen. I want to be prepared. And physicians in general and what we've just discussed, how does the new operating system that you talk about in your book help, especially yourself and physicians who are constantly working hard, delaying gratification? How can we find more happiness and fulfillment then?
Yeah, I think it's about cultivating attention to things that matter in life. I think there's so much noise out there particularly nowadays with social media, phones, everything. There's so many ways to get distracted or go down rabbit holes. And I think cultivating attention to things that matter is really the key, because how we spend our attention is how we end up spending our life. And I think most of us, myself included, give it away much too freely. And so if you think about cultivating attention to things that matter, one of the big things is paying attention to the evolutionary traps of your mind, which we just went through. And then I think positive psychology, what I love about positive psychology is it does a great job of clarifying priorities. And so, you could talk about the PERMA model. My partner and co-founder of ThriveRx is Jordan Feingold, who's I think just graduated from Sinai, so she's going to go on to be a positive psychiatrist. She developed this model called Revamp while she was at Penn doing her master's program, and Revamp is basically an organization of priorities that we should pay attention to, right? So relationships, we all know, are the most important predictor of well-being, right? Professional relationships, personal relationships. Engagement is basically, losing oneself, right? So getting out of your mind, not calming your mind, but really just getting out of your mind, being in a flow state, losing yourself. Vitality is what we all know about mind-body connection. It's very, very important. We go into heart rate variability. We go into some physiological things with meditation. And then accomplishment is really about doing meaningful work, high impact work that is at the cusp of where your skill and your desire really meet. And then meaning is really taking your high impact work or your accomplishments or your fully realized potential in the service of something other than yourself, which I think everybody on this call is probably doing already. And then P is for positive emotions. So find time to play, to laugh, to, infuse optimism and all of those things. So it's really a kind of a comprehensive model, but it's easy to remember. So if I'm having a bad day or a frustrating day at work, I can just think, okay, Revamp, what can I do? What's one thing I can do from one of those things? And it usually ends up helping. It usually ends up pulling me out of my head and grounding me. And so that's kind of how we explain it.
Wonderful. Wow, that's so simple, right? Everyone, Revamp. Relationships, engagement, vitality, accomplishment, meaning, positivity. That's pretty amazing to create a new operating system, right? How has positive psychology helped you and other physicians personally that you work with, especially in your RX course? Is this the Revamp model, what you work with them, and have they found that helpful? I mean, we're so grateful to our first responders, and you were mentioning prior to us getting on the call that it was kind of self-care wasn't in a great place before the pandemic, and now it's sort of worse. So, for those of us that are concerned about our physicians and those that help, how has your work been helpful, especially at this time?
Yeah, I think just first of all, the first thing that most physicians that we talk to really enjoy understanding is that they're not alone. That there's a lot of people that are feeling the way they feel. A lot of people, and I think this is true of mental health in general, but particularly physicians, because we're trained as lone wolves, as competitive, cutthroat people that are trying to get an edge on the other person. That's kind of how most of us went through most of our academic career. But to find out that they're not alone in their suffering, I think is the first thing, and it relieves a weight, a heavy burden that they all feel. So that's the first thing, is a sense of community, camaraderie, and you know what, we're all going through various degrees of suffering right now. And then I think it's more about what we talked about, which is, showing them some of the traps of their minds, going back through evolutionary perspective, and then giving them a ability to reorient their attention on things that are proven to matter, not what we think should matter or what's good or whatever, but actually what's been proven to matter in terms of well-being and a sense of life satisfaction. So I think just those three things: camaraderie, they're not alone; understanding the evolutionary traps of their mind, and then refocusing and clarifying priorities in a revamped framework. It has been really important, I think, for most of the people that we talk to.
And that's both personally and professionally. What about professionally for them?
Yeah, I mean, professionally, so the Thrive RX course is basically personal well-being, professional fulfillment, and financial independence, because you really can't be talking about feeding your soul if you're worried about feeding your stomach or living paycheck to paycheck. So this is really a comprehensive approach. It's more of this, it's more kind of, it's an expansion of the optimal living framework that I talked about in the book. But yeah, professionally, there's only two things that matter professionally. One is high impact work, and second is meaningful interactions. Those are the two things. If you can optimize for both of those things, you're going to be fulfilled. The problem is that most of us don't do enough high impact work. We do a lot of low level clerical work that probably other people should be doing, or should be automated, or should be eliminated. For physicians, this is the electronic medical record. They talk about death by 1,000 clicks. There's a whole thing on that, but it's really about creating your work environment and really your personal environment to focus on things that only you can do and only you want to do. And then when you do that, you save a lot of stress, you save a lot of fatigue, so that you're able to spend a few extra minutes fully present with an anxious patient without feeling rushed, right? Or you're able to stop looking at your phone and stare at your child in front of you who's asking you a question, being fully present, right? So it's about creating environments that really enable high impact work and meaningful interactions. So.
Can we delve into the personal a little bit? I know that you just mentioned that you're a parent of 4, right? How
Yeah.
has this philosophy, even the revamp philosophy, helped you in your parenting as you watch your children grow and knowing that the mind is the way the mind is, and so they're learning, right? Positive psychology isn't learned. I mean, it isn't automatic. It has to be taught. And watching that evolution, I'm just curious how that's helped you as a parent.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard as a parent, because you can never remember how you were at that stage, and you're always looking at it through your own lens of where you are now, which is, it's a dangerous lens sometimes, because you're at a totally different level than they are. I think concepts that I've tried to talk about with them has been, the importance of cultivating gratitude. We all know that's to me, that's probably positive psychology's greatest contribution, is a scientific study of gratitude, why that works, and how to cultivate it. And I think the reason I love that is because it's an antidote. It's a very effective antidote to hedonic adaptation, right? But if the key to not taking everything in our life for granted is to simply remember how to pay attention to it while we still have it, right? We all can pay attention to something once it's gone, but how can we pay attention to something while we still have it? And that's gratitude journaling, gratitude visits, gratitude letters, all the stuff that we've all talked about. And I've when I taught this stuff in a college class, the gratitude letter was really, really impactful for a lot of these students, just at a college level. So cultivating gratitude, because I think the reason gratitude works is because it takes us out of hedonic adaptation. That's something that we've tried to do pretty consistently as a family, teaching them about hedonic adaptation that, my son, wants to get the new MLB PlayStation game, even though he has got last year's game at home. You know, like when I ask him, do you really think that's worth the money? He replies like he always does when he wants something, oh yeah, this is going to be awesome. Just wait, And then, 3 months later, I asked him how it was, whether it was worth it. And he's like, oh, I don't know, maybe, I guess. He's adapted. And I've had many purchases where I've adapted, and I'm sure everybody on the call has had the same. So I think those are the two big areas that I tried to kind of push. And also maybe just kind of moving beyond superficial pleasure chases and understanding that there's a deeper level to access of flourishing that positive psychology can kind of give us some guidance to. It is
talk more about that. What do you mean by the guidance that we can get from positive psychology regarding flourishing?
Well, I think accessing a deeper level of what's important to you. So I pay very close attention to what they are naturally inclined to do as children. What are their natural interests? Where do they naturally flow to before the indoctrination of school, society, me, all of that stuff. So I think, we have a lot to learn from our kids if we pay attention to them, as opposed to stop trying to just mold them into what we think. And believe me, I'm as guilty as anyone on this, because we think we know best. And I'm a physician, and my oldest son wants to be a doctor, and so you're trying to guide him into a competitive road, but you're also trying to understand where he naturally is, and really, it's about uncovering their own personal strengths and their own personal potential, and just that concept alone is from positive psychology and flourishing and a deeper level of existing. So that's.
You led me right into where I wanted to go next, which is flow state, and how, the importance of that, and how you were talking about that in relationship to working with physicians. Is there a place as a physician where you're in the flow state, or is that separate from your work, or is it both?
Well, I think it can be part of work, but I think we've introduced too many variables that suck us out of our flow state in our environment. And I think the biggest one for us and for our kids is really our phones. So, it's hard to be in flow when you're checking your phone every couple minutes, right? It's hard to be in flow if you get a notification from social media or from email on your phone, right? You'll never get to flow that way. So a big thing, again, it goes back to cultivating attention. A big thing about attention is imposing constraints on yourself to create the right environment for flow, whether it's personally or professionally. So if I'm going for a walk outside on a nice day, I don't take my phone with me, because I know it'll end up being a distraction at some point. When we're working as physicians, and we're doing, what I call the physician zone, which is, our high impact work for an internist, that is a face-to-face interaction with a patient, right? Talking to the patient, understanding what exactly is going on with the patient, and then formulating a diagnostic and treatment plan, right? It's not with your, back to the patient typing into a keyboard, which is what most of the interactions are. And so it's about imposing constraints and creating your workflow to really maximize your ability to be fully present, personally and professionally. And so, I think for all of us, this whole digital well-being space and the intentional stealing of our attention by these media conglomerates is really, I think, a big problem with flow, and it's the antithesis of flow, really. And so I think fighting that at the first level is really where everybody should start. Certainly where I start, and where I try to teach my kids to start, because they especially need it. They don't know anything other than how they're living. They've grown up with phones, they've grown up with social media, and so they need constraints more than ever, to really be able to do what they're meant to do, to unleash their core potential, not just give it away and give their attention and their life away, mindlessly scrolling. You know,
Yeah.
so.
We had a question in the chat. Why do some people seem to always be living in conflict? They create one how do you say that? Catastrophe. I'll use that word, issue after another, money related, et cetera, et cetera.
Cataclysmic.
Thank you, cataclysmic. Thank you, Lois.
It's my brother. He's always doing it.
I think there are probably two reasons. One is familiarity, and comfort. Like, it's a familiar place to be in. If you're, it's part of your identity. Okay, I'm going to deal with this. I'm going to solve this. I'm going to do this. It's ironically, strangely comforting to be in conflict if that's where you typically live, because it's what you know. And I think the other thing is, it just goes back to your mind. Some people's minds are wired to really, really search for threats and negativity bias, which we all know about. And so that they're wired particularly. They're like a pit bull, barking at a stranger, as opposed to somebody else might being a little poodle, who barks less at strangers or threats. So those are a couple of reasons that I've seen with my work with physicians, why you have natural dispositions of being, overactive in terms of your conflict search and recognition of that search.
Can you talk a little bit about, in relationship to that, to stress and positive psychology, and especially in relationship to physicians? I mean, we're in fight or flight, freeze, right, a lot.
Yeah.
And Gary was mentioning that if we're in that toxic soup, if we're not getting out, Gary Redfeather, who was talking about not last week, the week before, about how that can create a climate. We were speaking about environments, a climate inside our body that can be toxic. And do you notice that happens with physicians a lot, and actually people as well? And what do you think in positive psychology can help with that kind of toxic soup created by fight, flight, freeze, and not being able to do something about it necessarily?
Yeah, that's a big problem. I think we all live in varying degrees of survival mode that way, and our sympathetic nervous system is overactive for pretty much all of us, I think. One of the things that I try to do is go a little bit upstream from the, rather than trying to modify the behavior. It's kind of like trimming branches on a tree, right? You'll be trimming this branch, but this branch will grow, and that's kind of the way negative thoughts and negative emotions occur. Rather than trying to change your behavior for the thought, when you feel stressed, or when you feel overwhelmed, which we all do, and myself included, rather than trying to just make myself feel better, which is really all of our instinctual things to do, I try to understand why it is I'm feeling that way. So go a little upstream onto what's happening right now, that's making me feel this way. Is this my mind manufacturing conflict by its natural search for threats and opportunities, or is it something that's real? And if it's real, then what can I do to change it, and make sure that I change it? I change the root cause. I'm a big believer in figuring out root cause of suffering. So, and that's what I mean by going upstream your mind creates thoughts, thoughts create behaviors and actions create consequences, which create more thoughts. So it's basically a feedback loop. So most of us spend most of our time at the behavior action level, right? Modifying what we do with our thoughts. But if you can go upstream and figure out why they occur in the first place, and maybe change something there at that level, if you can, or sometimes it's just ignoring it. If you know it's just your mind going, because that's the mind's job, you can thank the mind, which I do all the time. Yeah, thanks. I know you're looking out for me. I'm good. And you just ignore it, and the more you ignore your mind, it'll actually quiet down because it doesn't have a home in you. So those are a couple of things that we talk about.
That's wonderful. Gary was commenting, love it. All suffering is ultimately created and ended in the mind. Yeah.
Exactly right. I totally agree, Gary.
And how about Tall's permission to be human? How has that phrase affected you at all as a physician or physicians? I mean, sometimes it feels to me like physicians feel like they have all the answers, right? People come to them and they look to them like, what's wrong, doc? Right? And that's a certain amount of pressure too, right?
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. There's two phrases that I loved of Tall's. One is the permission to be human. The other is when you appreciate the good appreciates. Those are two things that I always remember from Tall. The permission to be human is about not, and again, this goes back to not trying to change or squash emotions that arise, right? Not if I feel bad, it's not just trying to figure out a way to feel good. It's understanding why it is I feel bad. First of all, by not judging yourself for feeling bad, right? You don't want to be unhappy about being unhappy, right? There's no effectiveness in that, and I think that's what Tall is talking about, right? You can let whatever emotion come up, and then it's better to understand the emotions rather than try to manage them or do things downstream from them. So that was a big thing from my takeaway from Tall's quote.
Yeah. And do you work with that with physicians? In other words, that whole thing of like, I'm not alone, that you were mentioning, that physicians really, when they take your course, they were like, oh, thank goodness, because I was trained to be the lone competitive wolf, right? But
Yeah.
I'm actually in community with other physicians. I'm not alone in thinking these thoughts or having that. Is permission to be human factor in there or not so much?
Well, I mean, permission to be human is just basically saying that we're all suffering to different degrees, and we're all connected to each other, and we're all part of the human race. So it's basically like to me, it's just like we're not separate from anybody, and so if you're suffering, that suffering is all around. It's I'm suffering, you're suffering, everybody's suffering. And so we should just not be judgmental about that suffering, which I think a lot of people feel bad about feeling bad, or feel why is this happening to me, or what's wrong with me that I don't feel better. And I think Tall's thing is just, feel the way you feel, and then try to understand why you feel that way, and then go from there. It's about understanding.
Right. And
To me.
compassion. And speaking of compassion, has Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion influenced you at all?
I don't know too much about her work on that. I think compassion is a natural offshoot in physicians, from when they can get back to what they were meant to do, the reasons they went to med school, the high impact work and meaningful interactions. I think compassion flows as a natural side effect, as opposed to trying to be compassionate, or force yourself to be compassionate. So
can you talk a little bit? We have our dialogue going on in the chat around suffering that comes from external circumstances, and the difference between that and the ones that are created in the mind. I think you're talking about two different things, right? You were mentioning with physicians, if they're worried about how they're going to get food on the table, or anyone, it's a little hard to feel in the flow state, for example.
yeah, I mean, what I'm talking about is in the absence of extreme poverty or trauma or anything like that, right? We're not talking about when you talk about external circumstances playing a relatively minor role in people's well-being, you're talking about for most of the world. You're not talking about a third world war-torn country where external circumstances certainly do matter to you. I think for most of us, I think the external circumstances can be either changed if they're at work. I'm talking about from physician's perspective. You can change your environment. You can modify your environment, where you can do things differently to create an environment that enables you to get back to high impact work. And that's what we work through a lot with physicians. Okay, we get into the details of what is their work environment like. What do they do every day, and then you try to basically modify and change that to amplify the things that we want to amplify, and remove or eliminate the things that or mitigate the things we don't want to spend time on. So
Deirdre, not us, you're serving in community-based health organizations. So I think you might be talking about oppression. If you want to unmute and clarify, you're welcome to in the chat. I don't know if she does. So basically, she wants to push back strongly about.
This is Deirdre. I'm unmuted.
Yeah,
Yes,
I just don't want to assume that I know what you mean.
Okay,
Deirdre,
but
go ahead.
I just heard the speaker say that doctors can do these things to alter their situations. And I'm saying that that's not always true. And if you're working in a community-based health organization, something that was said earlier about how you're always typing into your computer and you're not able to give FaceTime, you're not able to look into your clients or your person's eyes and all these other things. That's a reality. And there's also a reality in being a person of color, a health practitioner, dealing with trauma on a constant level. It's not imaginary. It's real. It's real. And I appreciate everything that's being said here, but some of it is someone in the chat group. That's what I was pushing back on, this idea that all of this begins and ends in one's head. That's what I'm pushing back against. That's not true all of the time. It may be true for people in slightly more privileged situations, but a lot of people are dealing with, including health practitioners, are dealing with a constant level of real trauma at the same time that we are trying to heal ourselves and others. That's what I'm talking about.
Beautiful. And I think that one of the reasons you started your course, Sanj, was to address this.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I totally agree with everything you said. So I think one of the other things that Tal talked about in the course, which I always remember, is the genius of the and, right? So it's not either or. It's not, that suffering is in the mind, which I do think it is, but it's also it can be around us. I mean, I know many physicians that are in really tough work environments. They work trauma centers, and they see a lot of stuff and night after night, and it takes its toll on them. There's no question about it. And no, that's not in their minds. But what they can do about it is, and people are starting to do this because now the administrators, which is this whole other level of healthcare, they recognize that it's a lot more expensive to recruit and replace a burned out, impaired physician who leaves medicine or leaves their job than it is to just make some changes that will help them stay put. And it's financially beneficial to do that. And so there's a lot of stuff about people hiring scribes in ERs to be able to take notes so the doctor can actually focus on the patient. Same with internists. There's a bunch of stuff that's happening in medicine. It's happening for two reasons. One is because it's getting to a really bad level, and secondly, because it's now financially beneficial to healthcare organizations to make sure physician well-being is a priority. And that's the only reason it's happening in a lot of places. And so I agree that it's not a panacea. Positive psychology is not a panacea. Nothing is a panacea. Nothing's going to eliminate all suffering everywhere. But a lot of suffering, as Gary alluded to and I alluded to, is in our minds. There's also a lot that's in our work environment, and what we can change out of the work environment, we should change. And we go through a lot of stuff that is in our control to change. Sometimes, and I've talked to a couple of physicians, sometimes the only thing to change is you, and that's leaving that position. So sometimes you can be in a very toxic, negative work environment, and your boss isn't going anywhere, or your environment's not changing, then you got to change. So those are a couple of things, but I totally agree with your underlying message and your sentiment.
That's wonderful. And I want you to tell us a little bit more about, is this one of the main reasons you started the course? Can you tell us about your course, your RX?
Yeah, I started the course similar to why I wanted a course that I wish I had in med school, and that's really what this course is. And I wanted to understand, and I didn't want to just go on a default societal path of kind of enlightened hedonism, basically just searching for the next stage or next pleasure dose. But I wanted to explain why that doesn't work for physicians. I wanted to understand and teach people how to gain professional fulfillment, how to reconnect with the reasons they became doctors in the first place, or healthcare providers, whatever capacity they are in medicine. And then third, I wanted to figure out ways to help them change active income to passive income, because I think when you're not worried so much about your paycheck, you can leave toxic work environments. You can maybe create an environment for yourself that may be beneficial. And so financial literacy and financial independence is a big deal. But I mean, to be honest, the real reason I created Thrive RX is to get to the kids of the families of the physicians and the patients. So physicians see about 1 million people. For every physician that dies of suicide, 1 million people or patients lose their physicians, and it's a lot, And so if you can keep physicians in medicine, give these principles to them so that they can in turn teach them to their patients and really to their kids at home. That's one way to scale a lot of positive psychology principles. And I think the youth epidemic, mental health epidemic, my wife's a counselor at a local college, and it's bad. I mean, I'm sure all of you know it, but it's not getting any better, and it's only getting worse. So I think if there's a backdoor way to get some of these concepts and principles to kids, this is just one other way to do it, is through physicians, through their families, through their patients' families. So
Yeah, we've had early on in the pandemic, we had a physician come on and talk to us about the problem of physician suicide. And I don't think that people are aware that that is actually a problem. You mentioned it briefly. Did you
Oh,
want
it's
to say
huge.
more?
About one physician every day dies of suicide. And these are people that you wouldn't think, they don't have histories of depression. They're not on it. They're people like you and I. People look at them and they think they've got, they're on top of the world. They've got everything. And in the end, they have nothing. So it's really a shame. And that's, again, that's camaraderie. And part of this is creating a community for physicians. The course is just priced for the CME. It's 7.5 hours of CME. So it's basically, we're doing this for the community. We're not doing this. We're all practicing physicians. None of us are doing this as a profitable side gig. It's just here's CME. You can use your CME expense account to get the course. But the real message is get the course, join the community, and then teach these to your family and to your kids to kind of keep them on the right track.
And remind me what CME stands for.
Oh, sorry. Continued medical education. I think it's CE for other other healthcare providers, but it's, we're required as physicians to get so many CME hours per year. And so it's just one way to do it.
And what's one piece of advice that you would give to all of us?
I would try to understand and try to just maybe gain a little bit of clarity on how all of our thoughts are chases to feel better, and just kind of watch that for a couple of days and see if that's true in your own life. And if it's not, it's great. It's true in my life and many other lives. And then I would do negative visualization. When you're at a stoplight for 30 seconds, mentally subtract something good in your life. When I'm driving home and I got to take my daughter to softball practice after a long day at work, I can, imagine that she'll be in college and she won't be here anymore living with me, and how much I'd crave to have a half-hour ride in the car with her. And then that kind of, it's the flip side of gratitude, but our brains respond much better to loss than to gain, right? So negative visualization, I think, is probably even more powerful than gratitude journaling, at least for me and for a lot of people I've done. So if there's one thing to do negative visualization a couple times a week on something. Wow.
Sort of imagining what you love that you don't have anymore.
Yeah, imagine if your job was no longer there and you have to, get your CV together and start interviewing and this and that. And, sometimes you just it's natural. We all take things for granted, right? So it helps. I think it's a powerful antidote to hedonic adaptation.
Wow. Talk about a powerful antidote. This conversation has been really enlightening. It's sort of given me a flip on hedonic adaptation and also on negative, what did you call it again? Negative
visualization.
That's new for us, I think. And I just thank you so much for your work that you're doing with physicians. And I think it's life-saving.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. And it's really a pleasure to connect with all of you guys. And I look forward to seeing what more talks you have.
Yeah. And everyone, please, if you are considering joining the Whole Being Institute course, the SIP program that Sanj and I have taken and many of the speakers have, I will put a link in the chat for you to do so. And feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye and thank you. And thank you again. The recording, you'll get the recording if you signed up for the
Thank you,
program.
Sanj. Thank you so much.
Fantastic.
Great luck.
Way to go. You
Thank you
guys
very
are the best.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Phoebe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Sanj.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Positive.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.